Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to another episode of the Security, Intelligence and Terrorism series. And today we are more than honored and privileged to have Daniel Stanton with us. He's a former executive manager in CSIS with hands-on experience addressing national and international security intelligence requirements in counterterrorism, counter-espionage, and counter-proliferation. Some of the things that he has been involved with, and we will be talking about this throughout the episode. He's one of the first class of civilian intelligence officers to be hired to work in CSIS. So let's start with that, and probably we'll go with the other parts where you have worked in. So if you could tell us a little bit about the Canadian security structure and before the civilian intelligence officer were being hired, was there military intelligence or only people from the military were being hired, or you were the first batch to be hired from the civilian side?
Certainly, with pleasure, Radnadeep. I'll give you the genesis of the organization where CSIS was created, which was actually a rather dark chapter, I would say, in Canadian history. In the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of illegal wrongdoings with what was called the RCMP security service. It started with terrorism. It started with the FLQ, Quebec separatists, and our current Prime Minister, his father, Pierre Trudeau, calling in the War Measures Act. And they looked at the intelligence they had available, and there really wasn't much. This was because the RCMP was largely a police organization. So throughout the 70s, there were various called royal commissions that decided, okay, intelligence on things like terrorism, espionage, and counter-subversion needs to be handled by a civilian entity because police officers have a different type of mindset and a different type of end game. And they created this legislation called the CSIS Act. This was in July 1984, which basically gave the service a legal mandate, which the RCMP did not have, that they could, do covert entries, recruit sources, get warranted powers, all sorts of wonderful things. How I came into this, well, I finished university. I was a humanities grad, and I went to Toronto looking for work. I was in retail. I was actually selling shoes. But a couple of years before I was hired, I sent an application to the RCMP and I put attention security service because I wanted to go into the security service. They did hire civilians. And then I forgot about it. And one day in March, I got a phone call and they were hiring investigators for this organization called CSIS. And I'd never even heard of it. So they kept my application through this transition to create this new body. And then I went through about 10 months of exams and interviews and tests and medicals and polygraphs and everything. And they hired me. And I went to Camp Borden. It's a military base outside Toronto with 32 colleagues from across the country. We didn't know each other, that we had been hired basically to be the new intelligence officers in this organization. It was a pretty exciting time, but we didn't have a lot of resources. We didn't even have an ability to do police checks. We didn't have a badge. We had a little piece of paper and a wallet. And it's because it's a civilian organization. So I've been quite fortunate. I've had 32 years and I saw the evolution of a security service that used to be in a paramilitary structure, and it evolved in a civilian, working overseas, working domestically as an intelligence service. And I think it's a very good one. I'm biased because I worked in CSIS, but I've worked with many other intelligence services. I've collaborated with others. familiar with the Indian structure and your services as well. And so I'm quite proud of the fact that we have CSIS, and we, most importantly, we have a legal mandate that everything they do is approved by the federal court, sanctioned from the legislation from Parliament. And so it's a pretty good organization. It has had controversy. It has had some incidents that have cost the service in terms of its reputation, and sometimes that's just the nature of it. It's complex work. It's complex legislation, and as you well know from things such as terrorism, it's a very complex environment that we have to work in.
Yeah. So my question is a little structured like this: that there's the provincial anti-terrorism section of the Ontario Provincial Police, and probably the other provincial police might have a similar wing. There's the RCMP, there's the CSE. So how does CSIS fit in all of this?
Okay, that's a really good question. I'll start with CSE because I worked with them a lot when I used to be a manager in some programs, and almost all the threats to Canadian security are overseas. So we work very closely with the Sikh agency. They're also same thing. Everything is legally approved, intercepts, very close corroboration. In terms of counterterrorism, and you mentioned provincial authorities and various police forces and the RCMP, the dominant one as far as law enforcement and terrorism is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They have a national security mandate, and they enforce the Criminal Code and the Anti-Terrorism Act in terms of prosecuting and also disrupting terrorist acts in concert with CSIS. You're right, there are provinces that have a mandate, such as the OPP and some municipal forces. They do more collection and assessment. They aren't really involved in prosecuting terrorists in Canada. That still falls to the RCMP because it's a very national program. And you're dealing, of course, with the court systems. This was something that came out of 9/11, even though Canada wasn't involved, a commission, whereas in the States, they had all sorts of jurisdictions looking at intelligence and security, and they wanted to sort of narrow it down to a few. And in Canada, really, it's the same thing. We really have CSIS and the RCMP as the principal agencies domestically in terms of terrorism, with CSE collecting information overseas.
Okay, so I'll go into the fact that you have worked in a pre-9/11 environment and you've worked in a post-9/11 environment. And a lot of people believe this, that the way we look at terrorism or terrorism studies have changed completely post-9/11. So what's your experience working in a CSIS pre-9/11 and post-9/11? Was there some changes?
That's an interesting question. A lot of people take 9/11 as the big, paradigm shift with terrorism and, of course, Al-Qaeda. Canada's 9/11 actually, a little closer to home here, was Air India Flight 182 in 1985, when Air India was basically blown up over the Irish Sea. That was our 9/11. And what it did is it gave Canadians a hint that we were going to have problems with the evidence and intelligence challenge in the court system. Because prior to that, terrorism was not looked at, certainly not by CSIS. It was only about a year, and prior to that, the RCMP. All the terrorist activities and presence was related to homeland issues in another country, whether it was Ireland, whether it was Sri Lanka, whether it was India, and a few other countries, Middle East, obviously. This was the first time that it was actually done on Canadian soil, and it was done against Canadians, because most of the victims on the plane were Canadian citizens of East Indian background. So right at the beginning, this is at 1985, 86, the government was faced with this problem. CSIS has collected intelligence, which can't go into a court proceedings. The RCMP now has to investigate and prosecute for a mass murder, and we can't get the two together. We can't get the sharing into a court. And that was a hint as to what would happen after 9/11, because since 9/11, Canada's been seized with that challenge. It's called the evidence into intelligence conundrum, which is being resolved. But it was kind of a foretaste of what was going to come as far as the legislative framework that we had and some of the challenges. So that was pre-9/11. It was mostly homeland issues, with the exception of Air India flight. That was a Canadian issue, as well as an Indian dimension to it. And a lot of them were kind of like fundraising issues, not a big deal. 9/11 actually started with a guy called Ahmed Rassam. Rassam was of Algerian background. He had some Canadian status. He wasn't a citizen. He left Canada. He went to Afghanistan. He was trained by Al-Qaeda. He came into Canada, and we missed him. He had an alias, and he got a bomb, and he was going to go to Los Angeles airport and blow it up. He was called the Millennium Bomber. That was actually, I would call, the first real bin Laden, Al-Qaeda type venture towards North America. And then you had 9/11, which was terrible. And then we had all sorts of plots, just as in Europe and around the world with Al-Qaeda inspired plots. We had what we called a bunch of guys plots. We had Toronto 18, which was 18 individuals who were radicalized, little groups, 3, 4 here and there, and then what we've had in the last few years, which is lone wolves. Now that's sort of the post 9/11 threat landscape from CSIS, or Canada, I should say, which is dominated by Islamic extremism, particularly radicalization. There's still been other threats. There's been some presences like Hezbollah and a few others you're probably familiar with. And of course, issues with Tamil Tigers, the LTTE. But it's the Sunni extremist radicalization that evolved, I would say, after 9/11, that Canadian government has been preoccupied with and is still quite preoccupied with. Not to the extent a lot of other countries. I would not say, certainly not like India, but I don't want to understate it. It is a serious threat, but in Canada, in my opinion, it's not as existential a threat as it is in other countries. You see what's going on in France, and you see what used to go on in the UK, and that. I think it's fairly managed now, as far as the government has. I've been retired for 3 years, so I'm not an authority on the threat environment. Not that I would get into all the details, but I think for Canadians, there's a pretty good confidence that the government's got this thing under wraps.
Yeah. So as you mentioned in the initial statements, that for Canada, it was not just that 9/11 movement that Canada was waiting for, because Canada had its fair share of problem, whether it's in 1970s with the FLQ or, as you mentioned, the Air India bombing. But the law for there's a law which a lot of countries do not have. Canada has a criminal code, which I think Section 83.1, which talks about it mentions about terrorism, but it has emphasized that terrorism, about terrorist activities and terrorism, but has not fairly defined what is it, right? How
You're right.
Problematic does that become for law agencies and intelligence agencies that are working to combat counterterrorism?
Yeah.
And why was a lot of waiting was for including this in the criminal code? It was post 9/11 that was included, but it had its fair share of incidents before 9/11.
Yes, well, you're very well informed. Let me just step back a little bit at when the CSIS Act was written in 1984. And as I may have alluded to, Canadian intelligence, largely security service, was focused completely on counterintelligence. It was catching spies, basically. And then they had a small remit on counter-subversion, which was communists and Marxist-Leninists and things like that, which nobody cares about anymore in Canada. So the legislation was set up for CSIS to collect intelligence with no idea that it would ever be brought into court, because the only court would be spies, and there was the Official Secrets Act, and they keep it quiet and you do that. The RCMP collects evidence. So CSIS warrants have what we call a lower threshold. I have to have a belief. I have to believe that Bloggins is going to become a terrorist, or Bloggins is aspiring to be a terrorist. And we can make that case and get powers from the court, very intrusive powers to do an investigation. But that's not at the standards of evidence that needs to go into court for a prosecution. So they put that in the criminal code, they bring in the Anti-Terrorism Act, and basically what it is someone who is about to commit a terrorist act or doing the means of planning or aspiring to go to Syria or to give money, that means you've crossed the line into that criminal activity. And that's where the RCMP is to collect on that. Problem with some of the cases may have CSIS information, which the government doesn't want because CSIS doesn't want it in there. The defense can go back and pull stuff up and it just gets kind of ugly. So the best way it works is if the RCMP starts collecting evidence early on, criminal evidence of a potential terrorist act and people that have crossed the line in terms of supporting terrorism that can go into court. It's not illegal to say you want to go to Syria and martyr yourself. It's not illegal to look on Google how to make a pressure cooker bomb. It's not illegal to say, I'm angry and I want to do something. You have to actually demonstrate and take the steps. And then you go into that criminal space and you're prosecuted on that. Not all counterterrorism work ends in a prosecution. Some people are deported. People that don't have Canadian status, they're kicked out of the country, and you don't hear a lot about that. And then there's, I'm sure as takes place in India, there's terrorist plots and efforts that are simply disruptive. CSIS got powers 3 years ago, which called disruptive powers, allowing them to, within reason, disrupt certain activities anywhere in the world in response to, let's say, anti-terrorism. And so the government's got that. The government's got criminal enforcement. The cases take a long time to prosecute. It's a liberal democracy. And then we have the deportation to sort of, I call these the outcomes. These are some of the outcomes in terrorism work.
So if you look at the larger picture, does it becomes very difficult to prosecute someone on the acts of terrorism because a violence act, but to harm someone on a larger scale or for a motive, to prove that motive in court, does it become very difficult in some sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me give you a really good case. It's in the public domain. It's called the Toronto 18 or 17. There's actually on video. You can see it, I think, on YouTube, where when the terrorists, and there was as many as 18, got the ammonium nitrate for the explosives. They'd already made circuit boards. They got the explosives. They were going to blow up a bunch of buildings in Toronto, including a CSIS office. They were going to go to Ottawa and kill the Prime Minister, cut off his head. The police waited till they were actually taking the ammonium nitrate out of the truck into a warehouse, and that's when they made the arrests. So we used to have a saying in the service, even though we didn't deal with the enforcement part, to get a good prosecution, the police have to start collecting evidence 1 hour before boom, meaning the intent is obviously there. You've got the equipment. You're going to derail a train. You're going to shoot somebody. You've talked about it. You got good sources. And that's really the time you're going to have a really strong case in court, where they have gone into that operational space and they have incriminated themselves. There's no doubt. You've got circuit boards, you've got explosives, you've got maps and charts. We know what you're doing, and the Canadian courts will prosecute that. There's no doubt, and we've had some cases like that. We call them a slam dunk. We've had other cases though that are harder to prosecute, and I shouldn't say we. It's not CSIS. Best analogy for CSIS is the canary in the coal mine. Where years ago they would have a canary, and the canary would die. And maybe that's not a good metaphor for CSIS, but it signaled that there was gas. There's a problem, and that's a lot of what CSIS does. Is they advise the government that we have a serious problem here. It could be in the domain of counterintelligence, could be counterterrorism, could be counter-proliferation, could be foreign interference, which is a big topical issue, as you probably have heard, particularly in the United States. So CSIS is that early warning radar that we've got something forming and gelling here that's going to be a national security problem. And then these other departments, law enforcement, immigration, foreign affairs, border security, they can use that to enforce their mandate because they also have a piece in the national security problem. But that's really what CSIS does. It's to provide critical intelligence that we have an emerging national security problem. Continue to monitor it while the police are collecting their evidence. In case there's any other links, external links, overseas links, somebody else we didn't know was involved, and try to keep that information out of the court proceedings because it just complicates things.
Yeah, there's an interesting case that's happening in Canada. I think the Alec Minassian case in 2018,
Right.
where he was accused of running down 10 people, and there's a various side of argument that's happening where the prosecution is happening, whether he was a terrorist, whether violent incel can be considered as.
I know.
So,
Terrible case.
yeah, so that was actually the context that I was asking you the previous question, whether it's very difficult to prove whether a person had the motive or not in court. But my next question is about your 9/11 experience. Everybody has a 9/11 experience, and people working in the intelligence agency might have. So I think it was a Tuesday morning and something around late summer and early fall in an eastern part of Canada.
Yeah.
So tell me what happened on that lovely day, but not a very lovely day for intelligence officer.
Yes, a very terrible day. I remember it very well. As like you say, everybody remembers where they were. It was the afternoon. It was a beautiful September day. And I actually was in, I was in a meeting with my boss, and I wasn't working CT. I was actually working on the counterintelligence side. And somebody knocked on the door and opened it and said a plane crashed in the World Trade Center. And we sort of looked at him and said, yeah, okay. I mean, it really didn't sound like a big deal. Plane crashed in the World Trade Center. Okay. And I went back to my office, and my wife, I'm divorced, but my wife at the time had called and said, Dan, a plane crashed. And I said, yeah, no, I heard a plane crash. She said, no, a second plane crashed in the World Trade Center. There's a terrorist attack. I want you to come home. Anyway, I couldn't come home. But I remember the day, and we thought, from an intelligence perspective, we thought, okay, 19 hijackers, some of them have to have a Canadian link. Some of them have to have spent time in Canada, like Rassam. Some of them have to have gone over to Afghanistan, and the country's going to be in trouble. The government's going to be in trouble. So, of course, we were going out and trying to find all our targets and everything else like that. Well, the truth is, none of them had a nexus to Canada at all. None of them. Well, you probably know the story. They're in Germany and Saudi Arabia based and everything else like that. But I think the feeling at the time, we felt useless in a way, because this horrible catastrophic terrorist attack happened, and we couldn't really do anything about it. We just wanted to find out if there were any links to Canada. Maybe there's phone numbers, maybe there's email addresses, fax numbers. This is 20 years ago, that we could help in the investigation as the Americans were seized with this. Yeah, terrible incident.
Yeah. And was there a feeling that you and hope and pray there's a Canadian was not involved in the act, and they did not use the possible route of routing through Canada and then entering US? Was that a first thing that came to your mind?
As an organization, yes. That's the first thing, because in Canada, as you know, like any country, the biggest issue is sovereignty. We maintain our sovereignty, we maintain our borders. Thank you very much, we'll take care of it. If some of the hijackers were living in Canada, coming back to Canada, going, let's say, the Middle East, and they were involved in the hijacking, and Canadian security had missed it all, we would then have a big problem with the Americans, right? For obvious reasons. If a country on your border is got terrorists and you're not doing a good job looking at it, then we would then have a problem with the Americans probably wanting to look at Canada for their own self-preservation. So when we found out that there were no links, that the 19 had nothing to do with Canada, I think there was a certain relief, and I don't mean CSIS, I mean probably in the government, that at least we weren't showing, we were like the weak link in this, or a vulnerability or an Achilles heel. And that's always there in the background anytime there's been a terrorist plot. And of course, the cooperation between Americans and Canadians is outstanding, because I mean, we have a shared border. And in a way, we have the same threat. We had troops in Afghanistan. We've had some presence, as you know, in Syria. So we share in a certain way being targeted. And so as a result, the cooperation is top drawer.
Okay, so I have this question now I'll ask you is, since you are part of CSIS, you will be the best person to answer this of not just attacks that happens in Canada, but Canadians who go to abroad and carry out attacks there.
Yeah.
And so this is the first thing I'll ask you. The next part will be about Canadians who join organization outside the foreign fighters. So in that way. So the first one is we have seen over the last few years, we have seen a lot of Canadians actually have went on to join various organizations, but also we have seen a lot of Canadians have carried out attacks foreign, whether it's the Momin Khwaja case, or we have seen the 26 cafe attack in Bangladesh, or the 2013 attack in the 2013 January attack, the Minas attack. So you could tell us about a little bit about Canadians carrying out attack on foreign soil, and how does the government deal with it?
It is. It's a good question, and it's fairly new. I mean, it's new in terms of as a security problem in the current environment. I mean, there's a history, of course. You may have read in the 1930s in Spain there was a lot of Canadians, British, Americans, and that who went to fight in the Civil War against Franco, and because they were communists and that. So this young men going abroad to partake in some great noble cause is not new, and it's never really been illegal just to go over to another country and get yourself killed. It is now if the person's presence and activities can be linked to support to a terrorist organization, and that's the critical piece. It's not illegal to fly to Turkey and go to Syria, or to go to Bangladesh, or what have you. And often it's hard to get information on the ground to know whether they are in fact with a terrorist organization, but it happens. So if they are linked to that terrorist organizations, and if they come back to Canada, yes, they can face prosecution, because it's a serious problem. One is they could be exposed to training. Two, they can even become more radicalized, because they're there with the boys, and they're hearing all this stuff, and maybe they've had some combat experience. So these people that can come back, as we've seen in other countries, perhaps in Europe, are a serious concern. So the message has been got out that if you're going to go and do that, if you're going to go to Somalia, or you're going to go to India, or you're going to go anywhere and get involved, then you are going to be in a real situation as far as the law is concerned. Location, which isn't really a security issue, but that's come from it, of course, and you've probably heard of, is children born to ISIS in another country, and they may have Canadian status. And what do we do? And I think the government's view is, well, we don't want to punish the children just because their parents are idiots. But it's I know with other countries they have more of this, and it's an ongoing issue of this repatriation, if you will, of children, where they were born over there, and maybe their mothers or maybe and they're in that kind of milieu.
So recently, over from 2014, we have seen a lot of Canadians have went abroad to join a lot of terrorist organization, whether it's to fight for ISIS. But I'll take a small example from, I think this was this particular mosque in Calgary where it was called the 8th and 8th Mosque, where they had a disproportionate number of members who went from
Yes.
Canada to go and join the ISIS. Uh,
Yeah.
so, what's the security challenge you are facing in Canada at the moment with people going abroad to fight, leaving their Canadian passport to go and fight for the ISIS? And
Yeah.
are you planning to, is the Canadian government planning to deport them or or let the country where they're fighting to prosecute them?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I think historically, for the most part, they've been Canadians. A number have gone over, mostly what we call converts. They converted to Islam, and they've adopted an extreme ideology. They've Al Qaeda, now ISIS. And they're very useful because they do keep their Canadian passport, and they can be used in various ways for over there by these organizations. But the challenge from an intelligence perspective is knowing when this individual who's radicalized and aspires to someday help build a caliphate, when are they actually going to do it? When are they actually going to travel? When are they going to, go there? And that's very hard to detect. I'm sure it's the same in India. Is where you move from being aspirational to operational, where you're no longer just talking the talk, as we say over here, and you're actually walking the walk, or you're going to start saving money, and you're going to give away your possessions. And you're going to try to get your passport, and you're going to show signs that maybe you're going to go do that. And if it can be proven in court that what you're doing is linked to supporting that organization, which is listed as an extremist organization, well, yes, you can be prosecuted before you leave. You can be essentially stopped. But the problem is getting the intelligence, the accurate, useful intelligence in that window where they're going to start becoming a problem, where they're crossing the line into criminal. That's the really important point I want to get across in this wonderful exchange this evening, is that crossing them that gray area of aspiring to do something to doing something. And people are smart. They can cover their tracks, and it's tough to get that. The police can't start collecting evidence when they haven't done anything yet. And then CSIS finishes its job when they are showing signs of that criminality.
Yeah. So, what to do with the foreign fighters who are coming back to Canada? And it won't be it won't be an easy job to prosecute them for the crimes that committed in a faraway country without any evidence on the table.
Yeah, I know. That's hard. That's hard. I mean, it's not really my area. I mean, I didn't deal with the prosecution on it, but the information the government would have to stand up in court as evidence. It can't be just somebody said this guy, was helping as a cook, let's say, at an ISIS base. Anything supportive at all. They would have to be demonstrated. I mean, I even asked the question once about videos, because a lot of them give what they call jihadi videos, where they're in front of a camera or something like that, and they're saying, Canada's awful, and these, we want to build this in Syria, and da 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 da, and is it preaching hate? And people say, well, no, actually, that video wouldn't stand up in court. Somebody could say someone was pointing a gun at him. Somebody could say he didn't really mean it. Somebody, it has to meet our evidentiary standards in a court of law. Not everybody knows he's working with a terrorist organization, but I mean, there is a way it can be done. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. The fact they've actually traveled over there and you prove they've joined and supported the organization, that's strong enough to get a prosecution if they come back. But it is not easy to get those details.
So I was talking to you about this yesterday, and let's talk about this interesting case which happened with the podcast, The Caliphate, where Rukmini went ahead and recorded this conversation with this Canadian called Shiroz Chaudhry, who was accused of going to join the Islamic State and become an executioner for the extremist
Right.
group before escaping its homeland. The Canadian court later found out that he was fabricating all those stories. How important is this for, if you could, for all those young people who are watching this, if you could, as an instructor right now at university, if you could tell this fact of how important it is to cross-check and recheck, especially when we are dealing with people who might be habitual liars and might put
Yeah.
out their stories to showcase their bravery out there.
Yeah. It's funny, Radnadeep. I actually one of the courses I teach at the University of Ottawa, it's called Tradecraft and Government Machinery. I actually deal with fabrications. The you've seen this in the Iraq NIE on WMD, the Americans, all sorts of things. In history, there have been fabricators whose information has gone into intelligence channels, and there's been consequences. And really with fabricators, it's basically we're dealing with deception, and there's really three. There's lies of omission, lies of commission, and lies of influence. And this is where I'm going to influence you and get you to believe me and my little story. And that sounds like what happened in this New York Times case, is that this individual, that the New York Times reporter, who I understand does really, really good work. She was quite regarded in some of her investigations, that she got in touch with him and he got her to believe his believable story that he was part of an assassin team. Even though it's kind of, I think, odd that someone just shows up in Syria and they say, hey, come on, you can join our A team and murder people. Without vetting and testing and evaluating and that sort of thing. But I mean, the New York Times, I read it. I think it's one of the best papers around. They are in the business of making money. And this was an investigative report that turned into a podcast. And I think that sometimes the intention of the interviewer is just as important as the intention of the source and the motivation of the source. If it was me, I would have had a few hours with this guy. And this may sound arrogant, but I would have broken down his story pretty quickly. But the first focus is the motivation. Why are you telling me this story? Is it for money? Is it you want to be famous? Is it you hate somebody? We need to narrow that down and then break it down, because what came out later was that there were inconsistencies in his story. Even his passport details suggested he wasn't in the country long enough. All sorts of things started to fall apart. And credit to the New York Times, they did determine it was a fabrication, and they did come out and they did say, hey, we were lied to. I had read that in the New York Times and some of these other big papers, they actually have journalists that work counterterrorism. They call it the CT beat. They have experience, not in the real work of counterterrorism, but in terms of journalism. They understand of ISIS. They probably understand as much as you do, because you seem very well informed on terrorism and how it works in a particular country, and that she didn't quite have that type of background. She worked in other areas. And I think she was taken in by the charm of the source, who proved to be a liar.
So here I have an interesting question of, so we have by nature established that people who go on to join ISIS from Canada are people who should be prosecuted because of various charges they might committed crimes in a foreign country. But what about people who are going to join organizations like the YPG, the Kurds, who are fighting ISIS, but they're not fighting for the Canadian army, right? They're fighting for a different army.
Yeah,
Do they also fall under prosecution of being labeled as
I,
terrorists?
I I don't think they would in the same, and I'm probably the wrong person to answer this. I know there is a concern about foreign fighters, and there may have been some time ago, maybe 2013, 2014, where there were some from the West going to help out the Kurds fight against ISIS, mercenaries. They don't fall under the same kind of scrutiny as someone going to do that with a terrorist organization. And I guess that's simply because the Kurdistan organizations aren't considered terrorists. So it's a different piece. I do know that they don't have any protection. You know, the Canadian government isn't going to go get them out if they get captured or anything like that, if they're doing something like that. But I think it's a different piece. And I don't really know. I know we haven't. I don't think Canada's had a big problem with many going over there, but I think it would be treated like somebody years ago going to be a mercenary in Africa or something like that, where it's kind of dumb what you're doing, and if you get caught, don't call us. But it certainly doesn't fall in the same category as going to support a terrorist organization. You got to remember, these organizations are recognized and listed and as a terrorist organization, which is a big deal, which means we consider you a terrorist organization and we don't consider this group a terrorist organization.
Okay. So let's come now to the to one of those most interesting conversations which our viewers might be looking at whenever we say about India and Canada. One of the most important things that comes into mind of people will be Khalistan, conspiracy, or the Sikh extremism. And you have been an investigator in Sikh extremism from the early 1990s, post Operation Blue Star, post the assassination of our Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. So, was the first time in your career you heard the word Khalistan or Sikh extremism? And you could tell a little bit about your experience investigating Sikh extremism.
Certainly. I probably heard about it when I was selling shoes in Toronto and Air India happened. I read newspapers and I probably would have seen Khalistan, but it wouldn't have registered at all. So I first really heard about it and the extent of the problem when I was training up at Camp Warden, when I joined CSIS, and you know, we were learning how to be investigators and we were getting lectures on security threats. And this was the biggest, it is today the biggest mass killing in Canadian history. I think it was the biggest aviation terrorist attack. It might still be, I'm not sure on that one, but it was a huge shock. Now I joined CSIS a year and 3 months after Air India. Yeah, and the organization was very new. Excuse me. So all counterintelligence, Soviet Union, bloc countries, subversives, and then a little, we called it a desk. Teams were like a desk, it's an RCMP term, working, Fabrication, International Sikh Youth Federation, all sorts of factions, you know, Khalistan factions in Toronto and Vancouver. So I worked in counterintelligence. I worked Soviet intelligence for about 5 years, and then I switched with another fellow who was working on the Sikh extremist desk. I was working International Sikh Youth Federation and a bit on the Babbers, which were still active in the 90s, and it was becoming more and more Sikh on Sikh violence, with still a threat, obviously, against India. But I worked that for a number of years. And then it later came back to it. I was in a headquarters position many years later, and I happened to cover that area geographically, which was responsible for it. I had a lot of contact. I've actually got a Kirpan that was given to me by a source. I want to say something that's really important. Canada has a lot of immigration from India, and there's a history of Sikh immigration. And Sikh people have made a phenomenal contribution to Canadian life. We have members of Parliament. Our Defense Minister, Mr. Sejan, is of Sikh background. So they have really contributed a lot. However, The Khalistan movement, as you would know more than I, and you know, the murder of Indira Gandhi and pogroms and Blue Star and its connections overseas became, and for many years was, the most serious national security threat in Canada. I know it was in Britain as well, and we cooperated with them a lot. It was, in my opinion, an intelligence failure. It was a huge intelligence failure on Canada's part. And I'm going to give you an anecdote. This is true. Of course, everything I'm saying is a true story, but it's public information. Is the day after Air India, the Canadian Prime Minister called Rajiv Gandhi, and he offered his condolences. That illustrates the thinking in Canada at the time that this was an Indian problem. Most of the victims were Canadian citizens. The children, the women, the old men, they were Canadians. There were Indian citizens as well. But of the over 300 victims, I think 283 were Canadians. In a way, Mr. Gandhi could have called our prime minister, but our thinking in the Canadian government was, this is an Indian issue. This is terrible, we'll call him. And that's a terrible thing when you think about it. But the thinking up until the attack was, this is a foreign country's problem. Because any manifestation of terrorist support in Canada before then, fundraising, moral support, propaganda, it was always another country's fault. It was the Fenians with Ireland, Palestinian, all sorts of stuff. It was always another country's fault. It was very, very rare, not another country's fault, another country's problem. It was very rare that it was an indigenous Canadian threat. And it was a failure. And I want to share something with you. I've met family members. When I was in Vancouver, many years later, I was the chief of counterterrorism. And every June, the RCMP task force, led by their assistant commissioner, would go and meet the families in Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa, Montreal. And I went with them because I was the CSIS rep, because I was working counterterrorism. I had nothing to do with the criminal investigation, court hearing, or anything like that. I went. And I actually met them. I actually sat like I'm sitting across from you, although we got quite a distance, with a man who told me about going to Heathrow to meet his daughter and wife, looking up at the board, delayed. And the anger over the acquittal, because there was a court case. So terrorism has never been just an abstract subject for me. It alters the lives of the people left behind. It's visceral, and it was a big wake-up call for Canada, because the Canadian government failed. There was a commission. There was a commission on this afterwards, saying how did this happen? You know, what were you doing? Just like there was with 9/11, Pearl Harbor. You know, it's important, not for accountability so much, but to make sure it doesn't happen again. You say, what went wrong? Why did this happen?
Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, on several occasions where the Indian diaspora out there, especially the Sikh diaspora, which have made a huge impact from 1914, if I remember, from the Kumaramaru incident where they wanted to allow 320 passengers, to defense minister,
Yes, terrible.
to holding one of the highest position in the country. That's a huge like success stories we have heard from our Indian diaspora, and that's really good. Coming to one of those things that I wanted to ask you is, during the period, a lot of hostility was there between where Indian government might be contacting the Canadian government to share information about certain extremist activities that were going on and certain foreign fundings that were coming in. In your time, I know this might not be in public domain and you will like to answer it in a different way. Under Section 8 of CSIS Act, was there information sharing between the two countries?
Do you mean before Air India?
No, post the assassination of Indira Gandhi and Operation Blue Star, was there when it was going on?
I would be quite confident it was. I'm with no doubt. I mean, I'm sure your Raw Research Institute or analysis wing and your military and intelligence bureau, I'm sure there was sharing. I mean, there'd be Canadian reporting. I'm not going to come up with any kind of lame defense as to why it was missed. I do have a theory, and it's when you get into the literature of intelligence and when you look at failures, in some ways they're a failure of the imagination. And I use analysts in a general sense. An investigator is an analyst. At one point, they're writing a report. It's not just somebody sitting up here with books or something like that. But when you do an analysis, and this is the same with 9/11, sometimes the wildest idea, like slamming a plane into the World Trade Center or putting bombs on a plane in Canadian soil that's going to blow up over 300 human beings, people don't think that can happen. It's got to do a little bit with cognitive bias. It's got to do with groupthink. There's all sorts of ways we can analyze this, but I don't think people working security and intelligence at that time, just before Air India, I don't think they allowed for the possibility that something that horrific would be planned and carried out on Canadian soil. I think they probably figured somebody's going to attack the Indian embassy or consulate, or shoot somebody. That happened in, I think, 88, 87. An Indian diplomat was shot, and he lived in British Columbia. But I don't think they thought something that risky and bold and evil would be planned and carried out on Canadian soil. Just like I don't think American intelligence in Afghanistan would be able to pull off such a horrific terrorist act. I think they were still had a more parochial view of what these extremists might do. And then that was kind of, if Air India, that was kind of the beginning of the end of extremism in Canada, because of course they did such a bold, risky thing, and then they became the subject and focus of police, security, law enforcement, everything internationally, and reduced threat to almost non-existent, or at least in Canada. But I think a lot of it is just, we as an analyst, maybe we project what we think they're going to do, or in most cases not do, with our biases, with precedents, and we don't allow for the possibility that they think differently than we do. And I think what happened after Blue Star, what happened after Indira Gandhi was killed, I think the rage, the radicalization, if you will, was underestimated, and that it would have a consequence like that.
Okay. So a lot of times, a lot of people have criticized the Canadian government for not taking suitable action for foreign fundings that comes from Canada. If you could a little bit tell us about foreign funding, not just to Sikh extremists, but to other groups as well that have been there over the period of time, a little bit about foreign funding and how does it affect Canada's image at the moment?
Yeah, it's a tough one. This is where we go back to what we call the listing process. If a terrorist organization is listed, People's Liberation for whatever, they're considered by the Canadian government to be a terrorist organization, then any money that can be proven has gone there and in there, whether it's, we call it like passing the plate around at church, whether it's maybe at a religious facility, or whether people are forced to contribute, or whether they're buying it. But the challenge is you have to prove that that money is actually ending up with that liberation movement overseas, and it's not going to to build a hospital or an orphanage or somebody's auntie or whatever. So there's all these covers, and you probably heard of Hawala and all sorts of things and how money can move around in that. But there, it has to be demonstrated. You know, Canada Revenue Agency, we've got all sorts of legal ways of stopping that. The services disruption powers as well, and things like that. So to basically choke it, they're using unemployment insurance and trying to put that into support of a terrorist organization, send the money overseas. We can stop that. But again, it's like the foreign fighter. What is he doing over there? You need to have some reliable intelligence that that money is going to that organization. It doesn't have to be buying guns. Like I said, it could be buying soup, but in any way it's construed as supporting the ideals and the organization of that terrorist group, you know.
So you have worked extensively with the RCMP on counterterrorism targets, and you have been the chief of counterterrorism at Vancouver as well from 2006 to 2009. So if you could tell us how do you focus probably on counterterrorism targets? What's the process of how you look at this, from gathering of intelligence to probably executing it? If you could tell us a little bit about that. And
yeah.
I'll just carry on. I have a follow-up question since you mentioned about listing, and recently we have seen the Canadian government list Proud Boys with the other groups as well. So how does listing or delisting terrorist organization or probably imposing sanctions actually help in counterterrorism? Does it help in any ways?
Well, yeah, it does. I mean, when things are listed, like for example, when you see on the news, the Minister of Public Safety says Proud Boys are listed. And it's not because what happened in the States in January 6th. It would mean that the government was getting intelligence for quite some time, indicating that Proud Boys has crossed that threshold as a national security threat. So it's not like it's a political correctness. It's been building from some time, and the minister wants Canadians to know, yeah, we're already looking at these guys, you know, on that sort of thing. So, and this isn't the first time CSIS looked at it at an extreme right wing. We had a group in Toronto called the Heritage Front a number of years ago. Oh, you're familiar. And it was very controversial. There was an asset or a source outed and things like that. But generally, CSIS stayed away from the right wing, left wing, because two reasons. One, a lot of their activities was just purely criminal. And two, that type of terrorism, you get kind of close to subversion and dissent. And you got to be kind of careful on that, you know, especially if you look at left-wing types of extremist groups. But so right now they're viewed as a terrorist group. So that would mean that the RCMP would collect evidence if there's a threat to prosecute someone on that. And the delisting helps. It means that certain airplanes they're not going to be able to get on. It means that fundraising is going to be hard. Maybe they want to sell their funny T-shirts and make money and do that. And the listing also helps if CSIS, the RCMP, want to go to the federal court and get powers. You could say to the judge, look, they're listed as a terrorist organization. This isn't just my opinion. They're listed, and other countries listed. So it is helpful, but it's not the beginning. There's already been a concern, and there's already been investigations before the listing process. I think it's more of an assurance to people that we're covering them. It's not a new legislative tool that came in or anything like that.
Yeah, so let me come in and ask you this, that since you mentioned it's a legislative process, I understand, but on looking at from your angle, at a counterterrorism angle, it's just that you're putting that organization in your radar and you're probably looking at monitoring their activities closely. But if someone comes, a member of the Proud Boys comes, or probably a person from the ISIS come, he won't have an ID card written that I'm from ISIS, right? So your counterterrorism in that way still remains the same, right? The effort.
Yes.
It does not reduces your
Yeah.
counterterrorism effort by any chance.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just it's the same. I'm sure it is in India, Ratnabeeb. It's indications. You know, there's like a signature or an indications that they're with that group. Like we looked at, I'll bring back up again the Toronto 18. We looked at the process of radicalization and the continuum they go along, ideology, bonding together, statements, things that are purchased, and who you know. Okay, I am close friends with a person who's a target, who's a terrorist, and you do your best to find all sorts of exculpatory or contextual reasons that the contact is benign and is not involved in the terrorism. So you're basically building a case. And with CSIS, it's not an evidence case. It's easy. It's a belief and statement type of case. And in the RCMP, they're building the case that will stand up in a court. And it's everything they do together. They communicate, whether there's an element of covertness in some of these relationships, things like that, that you can sort of build that type of argument that this person is a terrorist. And it just comes with experience. You get one case and they behave the same way. You have this cell, these two cells in Toronto, and you have another case in Ottawa, and it's the same method, and it's the same cultivation and recruitment, and that you see, and you explain that, and you say, this is why we believe they're involved in terrorist activities, or they're about to.
Okay, so I think you didn't answer one of the questions that I asked. Actually, if you could tell us a little bit of how from your field agents collecting the information reaches to the analysis, and then you probably go ahead and execute a task or counterterrorism task. If you could a little bit tell us about that.
Sure. From what we do, what the service does is they conduct an investigation. If we're talking terrorism, we're talking investigation. So we investigate the standard threat without any court approved powers or whatever. You would do much like I'm sure you would do in India. You do basic investigation, who the contacts are, any external contacts overseas, any funding, what type of communications, things like that. If the investigation hits a wall, meaning we need more intrusive powers, computer, phone, everything like that, you have to go to the court and you have to say, we need these more powers, searches, all sorts of stuff, in order to determine how serious this threat is, because we've now got an indication it's a serious threat. The court gives those powers, and it allows CSIS to do even more intrusive powers because they're convinced this is a threat. And then they're collecting the information. But they don't want to collect something that the police are going to use in court, because the defense will say the CSIS threshold to collect that is lower than police. We want to see what CSIS based their warrant request on, and then that's when it starts getting ugly. So we do that investigation, and there's been a number of them where it's getting to the point they're going to do something. The RCMP comes in, and they're covertly collecting evidence, getting them to that point, and then they arrest them, and it goes into court, and then there's information disclosed. And the service doesn't want any of its information in there. And there's a bit of a back and forth on it. So that would be part of my job, for example, when I was in Vancouver, is making sure we keep the separation. I used to call it separation church and state, making sure that our information didn't go into the RCMPs because it would taint the investigation potentially. Because police officers want all sorts of information. They want whatever you're going to tell them. We don't want our information going into the court, because then it's going to muck up the prosecution. And it could reveal our sources and our methodologies and things like that. And it's not an easy model. It's got its challenges. I do see it's getting better, but it's a complex model. It's partly because the legislation is complex. Got about 6 or 7 pieces of legislation, I could quote you if it wanted to, but you got the main one, CSIS Act, Criminal Code, and the Terrorism Act, things like that. And that's basically how it is. And it's harder for the police because they need to have a higher threshold. They need to see indications of a crime about to be committed. For CSIS, we just need to believe that they could be involved in terrorist activities, which is lower threshold. And the government doesn't want CSIS's lower threshold to be used to get evidence to send someone to prison.
Yeah. So a little bit taking forward from that. So if the RCMP or the government by end of the day alleges that CSIS had not been able to do due diligence and have probably there's an intelligence failure, then there is no other option to go back or forced to bring out evidence to show that there was intelligence, but the policymakers did not act on it, because that would mean putting out your own sources out there, right? So that becomes a little difficult challenge that you have to stay in the organization and take probably the brunt of the government end of the day to put the blame on the CSIS.
Yes, that's sometimes happens. I mean, if there was information that this group is going to blow something up next week, I mean, common sense, that information would be given, and the government would make the call. Well, in this particular case, we're prepared to compromise some of that what, let's say, CSIS had, because we want to protect people. I mean, that everybody knows that the end game is public safety. It's to protect Canadians. It's not to play these little games of disclosure and who's smarter than whom. What I'm talking about is where it's not really information that's going to put someone in jail. It's kind of the case building. This person's radicalized. This person adores ISIS, and this person wants to do something. And so it's to keep that stuff out of the prosecution, of the evidence chain, because again, evidence is subject to more scrutiny and examination and higher standards than what CSIS collects, which is information. See, CSIS collects information all the time. When I was an investigator, I didn't show a badge. I didn't say you had to talk to me. You could walk away, because I would tell you anything you tell me will never go into court. We will go to the nth degree and never identify you. So we're just collecting information. So when I was an investigator, even when I was working CT, I didn't think this case could end up in court, so I better start collecting evidence. I'm not allowed. I'm not trained to. I'm just collecting information. I just want you to talk to me, and I want you to keep talking to me. And I want you to tell me the really interesting information and get really close. So it's kind of like this organization is hardwired and programmed to collect information without any idea or concern whether someone's going to be deported, or a diplomat's going to be kicked out of the country, or a terrorist's going to go to jail. That's how it's supposed to work. It's civilian intelligence collecting, and I don't really care the outcome. I do in a way, but I'm not thinking of a prosecution at the beginning of the investigation, whether it's counterintelligence or counterterrorism. Whereas police, it's different. Police they're kind of looking back a bit, and they're looking for that evidence and proof because they need to prosecute. They need to charge people. That's what they're paid to do. They do run intelligence as well. Of course, they're police, but it's two different mandates. And since 9/11, the RCMP and CSIS domestically, those counterterrorism mandates have been kind of merging together, kind of like Venn diagrams. Because this was never imagined in 1984 when the legislation was written, that our targets in CSIS would ever end up in court. Right? Who would have thought of that in 1984?
Okay, so now let's come to Afghanistan a little bit, and let's talk about Afghanistan for a while. And then I'll probably end with radicalization and one of the most asked questions about intelligence services. So you have served as a supervisor in the analysis branch for South Asia and Afghanistan. So this question comes that a lot of people does not know the contribution of Canada in the war in Afghanistan. That this Canada joined around 2001 and left around 2014, and more than 40,000 members of the Canadian Armed Forces served in Afghanistan. And I think, if I'm not wrong, around 165 Canadians died during the war in Afghanistan.
Yes.
158 soldiers and 7 civilians, and more than 2,000 members of the armed forces were wounded or injured in the war. And one of those, in fact, right after the invasion in Afghanistan, Canada had also a very important role in the naval contribution with the naval campaign, and also most importantly, I believe, with the Kabul and Kandahar, where there was it was responsible for between 2006 and 11 for the transfer. It was transferred to the southern Afghan city of Kandahar and so on. So, if you could tell us, your audience, a little bit about the contribution of Canada in Afghanistan, and probably we can go ahead and talk a little bit from there of what the situation right now is in Afghanistan, and what is you, who has served in the intelligence agency and have seen probably Canada going through this 2001 to 2014 in a war-torn country, and what they left with and what they see now.
Yes. Yes. Good question. Canada's always had an interest in South Asia. We just talked about the immigration piece and all sorts of connections and links. And our involvement in Afghanistan came immediately from 9/11. We were there with our allies and friends, principally the Americans, in support in what very limited capacity we could, and sent over there. And the service was involved as well in terms of providing intelligence and human on that. When I was in the analytical branch, which was much before then, one of the areas I was looking at was this organization called the Taliban and this Mullah Omar and things like that. And I think, like most countries, we were trying to get a handle on what is this and what's going on, and Pashtuns and all these links and things like that. And then the whole Al Qaeda piece came out, and I remember we were assessing what this all meant with the former Mujahideen based there and Bin Laden, and you know this probably better than I do, on cover. But it was a very multi-departmental Team Canada. We call these projects Team Canada often, where we go, and it was very, very sad. Canadian Armed Forces that lost people, that people were injured, people highly affected by the experience that's there, and then particularly now when you look at the country and what's really changed. But yeah, in a CT perspective, that gave us a certain insight into various groups and linkages. As you know, there's a whole bunch of terrorist groups in and out of there, just as there's a whole bunch of states in and out of there. Afghanistan has been a country that's had so many foreign states involved way before the Soviet Union invaded. And so it's, as an intelligence piece, it's been a priority. It probably always will be a priority, because while it's far from Canada, it impacts on Canadian interests. And that's really where our government comes into it, is how do these things impact on Canadian interests? And then there's the humanitarian piece. And then there's the treatment of women, and there's all those other issues that other parts of the Canadian government want to have a say in, and want to help, and want to provide aid, and all that. Just as I'm sure India has vested interests in getting a stable Afghanistan in such proximity to Pakistan, which used to be part of India. It's more than in your backyard, and not be for me to lecture on that. But yeah, it also, for CSIS, was sort of what brought the service more overseas. There's nothing in the mandate on national security preventing CSIS from working overseas. But Afghanistan actually is where we got what we call a footprint, as we were there. I was actually considering going over at one point, and then I got transferred. So it was it was a big it had a big impact on the organization as well, and helped our evolution as an intelligence service from being just a security service.
Yeah, in fact, let me have a small confession that I was reading this book, The Dogs Are Eating Them, A War in Afghanistan by Graham Smith, and that actually it made me interested a lot in studying Canada's involvement in Afghanistan. And it was really, like we have heard the United States involvement, but Canada's involvement was a lot of people doesn't know. So I thought of bringing this question to you. If we also a lot of eyeballs it grabbed during that time when Umar Kader was becoming the first minor to be convicted post World War. If you could tell Second World War, if you could tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean that. I mean, he was 15, right? And his father was, I forget his name. I mean, you know, he was Al Qaeda, and he was, I think, a very controlling, manipulative man. And Omar was over there, and how he reacted, and you know, it became it's interesting because it became a bit of a watershed case in Canadian law and jurisprudence, and on again when I talked about the evidence intelligence, because the service was compelled to provide some information it had on it. Being prosecuted as a terrorist, you can't have one branch of the government say, here's all the information, and another branch of the government say, well, we're not going to tell you anything because it has the word secret on it. So CSIS was actually compelled to reveal some information it had. And then you may have also heard about the family. There's the Kader family, and you know, siblings and issues like that. Yeah, it's a sensitive case. It's a tough case. I think he was just basically a kid, really, who got caught up in you know, his father's crusade. That's the right word. And unfortunately, and then he was in Guantanamo Bay. So he had killed an American soldier, and was prosecuted. But you know, that's a universal, not theme, but challenge for the government and for CSIS, is when you get Canadians again connected and tied and involved with a terrorist organization. It could be in India, it could be in Pakistan, it could be wherever. And the Canadian government, in a way, I don't want to say they have a responsibility, but they can't just, you know, whatever. They're over there. If they're using Canadian status and Canadian passports and Canadian support to help these groups, then they're going to be subject to the laws. Right? Can't do that. And CSIS has to get that information. They're obligated to demonstrate that they've done due diligence and done as much as they could to see. Or maybe there's a link in Canada to this person who's been arrested somewhere else for terrorism. That's the first thing, right? I know how is this person working alone? You know, maybe they're arrested in India. Maybe they're just doing this themselves. Maybe they have support somewhere else.
Yeah. So now let's come to radicalization part, where you also have a fair amount of experience working in domestic radicalization, looking at extremism. So is there a direct correlation between the amount of material, propaganda material that a person is subjected to and the level of radicalization, or is it different factors that comes into picture of what their past experiences, of whether they have found something on from their families, or religious causes? How does radicalization actually takes place? If you could tell us about that. And secondly, with the advent of cyber domain, and you have also a fair amount of experience looking at cybersecurity, of how the cyber domain has made radicalization more democratized, if I could use the word.
Yeah, that's a that's a good one, Ranji. Yeah, I mean, when we looked at radicalization, like in the service, it was kind of like too late in a way. Like they've already come to our attention as sort of they're radicalized. But as I mentioned before, not at the point of operationalized, and it's a really problem. And I'm not a psychologist, and I don't pretend to be one, but I think the rapidity of radicalization depends on the individual, depends on the circumstances, depends on what's going on in their personal life, the predisposition they have to listen to this and to believe in this, and what's going on. I mean, what we found was a lot of ours were young men, generally in their 20s. There were some older ones, but usually it was young men. And in all of them, I would say, were looking for something. Some had been in some criminal organizations, and most of them had converted. Again, they were looking for something, and they may have had help in that conversion by the wrong person. And I know you've probably heard of Awalki and some of these other very charismatic leaders who can almost be magnetic in a way in their videos. I've looked at some of their videos, and I can understand the appeal. So you have a young individual who feels a little lost, maybe doesn't have friends, maybe doesn't get along with his father or mother or whatever, I don't know. And they start to see the clarity and the simplicity of this narrative, whether it's Al Qaeda or whether it's ISIS, and then they want to do something. I think maybe this is why it's more of a male thing, I don't know, but they feel they got to do something. And before Syria became a problem, they wanted to do something in Canada, and they would use the excuse, well, Canada sends troops in Afghanistan and they're killing Muslims and that sort of thing. But Syria was great in a way because it gave them this new land to go to and to build a caliphate. And so it's just perfect. My life really isn't great. I'm unhappy. I can't date any women because they're all kind of uppity here in the West and difficult. And if I go over there, I'm going to meet the right woman and she'll have my children, and I got a real group of people. And when I die, I'm going to go to paradise. And you know that, right? I mean, there's this whole narrative really about it. And what I saw was the challenge with someone who's radicalized, and they can go from like 20 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour, just like that. And we don't really know what triggers it because it's what's going on in their life. I've also seen people that have been fairly radicalized, and I'll call it kind of self-de-radicalization. There's things that happen in their life, and maybe they get a job, maybe they meet someone, maybe they grow up, and they kind of move away from this Syria nonsense and that sort of thing. But it's troubling, and I mean, it's not just, we call it the jihadis or whatever we want to call the targets. I mean, I would say Sikh extremism in its days was a form of radicalization in a way. There's a story, there's whatever that is appealing again to these young men to do things, and there's all sorts of types of radicalization. And I would add the same thing probably to right-wing extremists. We're seeing going on in the United States, where people are looking for some explanation, a simple explanation as to why the world is so cold towards them and complicated. And I hope I don't sound too poetic or psychological here, but I think it really is. It's a very personal journey in radicalization, and you can't just say, okay, well, we're going to do this and de-radicalize them and then put them over here. I'll share one with you. It was in the news. One of the Toronto 18 went to prison. He was a Canadian of Somalian background. He got out of prison. He was on parole, I think it was about a year. And then he stole somebody's passport, and he ended up in Syria, and he ended up killed. He joined Daesh, he joined ISIS. So, I mean, it's not just, we call it the targets. I mean, I would say Sikh extremism in its days was a form of radicalization in a way. There's a story, there's whatever that is appealing again to these young men to do things, and there's all sorts of types of radicalization. And I I raise that because the Prime Minister of the day was quoted in the press saying, "What's going on? How did this happen?" Well, we don't know. We don't know. We don't know what went on in his mind. We don't know why dying in the Middle East was more preferable to him than rebuilding his life in Toronto.
Okay, so let's come to the final question that I have, and probably I'll ask you about some resources later on. So a lot of people, before I go to the most asked question, let me ask you one thing. Since you have worked as an intelligence officer, probably recruiting more people who are working on ground, and you have worked as an analyst as well. So if you could tell a little bit difference, what's the work of an intelligence officer and the work of an analyst, the distinction, and how did you fit both the roles over there? And a lot of people from India, from people who have, we have some people following abroad as well, from Canada as well, who have asked me this question and asked me to, when I said that I'm interviewing you, to ask you this, of how to join probably an organization like CSIS or RCMP or CSE. Uh, if you're a Canadian citizen, what's the way? And if you're an immigrant, probably someone going out from, say, India and going to Canada, how can they join the organization? And what would you suggest them to do?
That's a good question. Let me answer the second question first. You can join, whether it's CSIS, CSE, or CMP. You have to be a Canadian citizen. But if you've lived in Canada for 10 years and you have Canadian citizenship, I mean, I work with people as intelligence officers, as language experts, whatever, who are born overseas, India, Iran, because they bring context, they bring understanding, as well as maybe a language ability and things like that. So there's no restriction on that in Canada. Our organizations, at least when I left CSIS, is very reflective of the Canadian mosaic. And it's not because somebody says you must have diversity, it's because it actually makes the organization more effective on that. I like the question you asked about investigator analyst. When I joined, the intelligence officer, they believed could do both. So we were trained as investigators only because we were going to the field first. But the expectation was we'd be transferred to Ottawa and we'd be an analyst. And they believed in what I used to call super IO. They thought every intelligence officer was like super person. You could recruit sources, do investigations, do surveillance, and you could do analytical work, and you could write papers, and you could think deep thoughts, and you could coordinate investigations. And the reality became, no, it doesn't quite work that way. Some people aren't very good at doing this. Some people aren't very good at doing that. So they became a little more specialized. So regions still do the collection right across the country, and then overseas, and then headquarters. There's various types of analysts. There's strategic analysts who sort of are very academic, and they write big strategic papers. They're classified. And we have tactical analysts. We're doing more in support of investigations and bringing it to that. And an intelligence officer can work as an analyst. They can work coordinating cases. They're dealing with the regions. They're reading all sources of information and trying to get some insight into what might happen, because that's what CSIS does. They're looking at what might happen in the world, and particularly in Canada. And so the idea an intelligence officer can do both jobs really well, I don't know. But there are those opportunities, particularly intelligence officer, to do all sorts of those opportunities, or work overseas, or work in liaison capacities, or things like that. It's yeah, and I think now it's a really exciting time, because when I joined before the internet was up and running, right? We had to go to the libraries and take out books and things. That's why I got all these, is that we didn't have an internet. But I think now, I mean, with OSINT and everything else and Google Maps, I mean, it must be just phenomenal, the type of analytical horsepower an organization can kind of tap into. And it's just fascinating to try to get a really accurate picture of what's going on and most importantly, what's going to happen that'll impact on security.
Yeah, I can completely understand. By the time when you joined, in Afghanistan, there were pamphlets being distributed for radicalization, small pamphlets, and now you have the internet where it doesn't have any boundaries. I can completely understand. But let me take a little bit from where you mentioned about you need at least 10 years to be, you need to be Canadian citizen at least 10 years in Canada to join CSIS.
No,
So,
sorry, sorry, excuse me. I may not be right on that. You need to have at least 10 years to get citizenship of living.
okay.
Yes.
Okay, so what do you suggest people who are immigrants going out there and doing for 10 years? Do they should work in other fields? Does that help?
Yes. We don't have a tradition in Canada. Intelligence is new. It started really Second World War for Canada. So we don't have a history or a culture of, like in the United States, you could study it, right? They've got schools. Well, I got schools for everything in the United States, but we don't have that. So when I joined, most were like me. They had degrees in social sciences, humanities, maybe criminology, psychology. When I left, people had degrees in anything. Like to be an intelligence officer, you could have a degree in computer programming, business. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you can do research, you can do analysis, and really important that you can write. It's important to have good writing skills. I mean, there's Canadians born and raised in English or French that can't write well. I think a lot of it's got to do with the internet, but that's important. But my advice would, and I've been giving advice to some young folks who had the same questions you've asked, is don't just focus on terrorism or cyber. There's a lot more, counter-proliferation, strategic policy, and maybe some areas that are a bit of a niche, that somebody doesn't have a lot of background on and things like that, and focus on getting your degree, or if you go to a college and getting your certificate, and ideally maybe you have that, we call it a third language, but if you're a native speaker of another language, that has a lot of cachet. I mean, Canada is able to exploit that because we have so many cultures and languages. But my advice is just get a good education, and don't worry that it should be political science or it should be courses on terrorism. And I know you're really interested in terrorism, but I'm saying just focus on that. And then as you look at all sorts of areas for security intelligence, and it's not just those three we mentioned. I mean, CBSA also has a security side. Foreign affairs has an intelligence mandate of sorts and in collection and analysis. There's all sorts of policy centers, assessment, Privy Council, but focus on that. The other piece of advice I give to people is get a bit of life experience. It's important. I never thought my years washing dishes and selling shoes would be so handy when I was before the board for CSIS, because I was unhappy. I didn't like the jobs. I thought I was a big shot, but it ended up I was able to parlay those jobs I had with life experience and kind of sell myself for the job as an intelligence officer.
Perfect. Okay, so that gives a huge, I think, understanding of what the context is, how a person can actually go and join. And for a lot of immigrants who have asked this question, I think they got an understanding that it's not 10 years that you have to go and do some other job. It's 10 years you can learn something, as you mentioned out there. So that's a very fascinating, like probably be the best one of the best week someone can actually give a suggestion to all those people who are asking the question. So finally, before I let you go, what's you have mentioned that you worked in not just counter terrorism, you've also worked in counter espionage and proliferation. Could you little bit tell us a little bit about that to our audience?
I can. I worked a lot, actually. I probably spent a little more of my time. I spent 13 years in CT, as we call it, but I spent more, Russians, Chinese, Iran, And I actually enjoyed it more than terrorism. Maybe I shouldn't say this on your show. And I think it's because those types of investigations, we were dealing with state actors. You know, I mean, Hezbollah is a bit of a state actor more than a non-state actor, and you probably know some other ones, particularly in that region. But I found investigations involving state organizations or hostile intelligence services more interesting. There may be more complex, there may be some deception. That I had a lot of fun in those areas, and I started working that area. I started working as one of the Soviet services against it, and I liked CT. Don't get me wrong; it's the most important program service the Canadian government has. But I just enjoyed counterintelligence. And I think it's because we owned it more. Whereas with CT, when it got really interesting, that's the time for law enforcement. So it's like, here you go. So I enjoyed that. I like that. I like working against hard, sophisticated targets. Not all terrorists are smart. They're not. It's not like Hollywood. And you know, I hope I don't offend any if they're watching this show, but they're not the smartest. I think it's because they're radicalized, really. They just don't care. But I liked as an investigator having a target that's smart and careful and cautious. And maybe I might think the wrong way or get it wrong, but I always found that more interesting. I always like that point where we're not really sure what's going on, but we think something's going on.
Well, that's I think for the first time I heard from someone they enjoy counter-proliferation and counter-espionage more than counter-terrorism. But that's a new thing that I've heard. So that's something first time on the show someone has confessed that. So one last thing for our young audience like me, and for probably you are an instructor, you understand students. If you could suggest some materials they can read probably on terrorism, counterterrorism, radicalization, and opposed when you are in the services, you are exposure to huge amount of resources. Probably some of them classified, some of them from directly from. I heard someone say they had access to, I think, an internet organization news briefings that comes in the morning. I forgot the exact name of the site where the analyst used to get access to daily briefings.
Yeah.
But when you retire, you don't have access to all those information. What's
No.
your right of information right now?
You know, the funny thing is, you're going to think I'm some real odd duck here, but I never liked reading about terrorism in books because it just, I don't know. I'm trying to think. I actually never even liked reading a lot about work stuff. I mean, all my reading tastes are completely outside of that. I read a lot about Cold War. I read a lot, you know, the British experience and Americans and traitors and all that sort of stuff. But I never really, I was never current on a lot what's going on. And I think because a lot of it's in the media, a lot of it's gone on. And, you know, there's, whether it's bombings in Jordan or, you know, things going on and Indian subcontinent, Lashkar-e-Toiba and Mumbai attacks and things like that. These things have already been written about, and there's been movies about it, things like that. Whereas in counterintelligence, a lot of it remains classified. So I apologize, I can't really think of a book on CT on that. I probably gone more into the psychology of radicalization, where there's been a lot of research on it, and the type of brain that's susceptible to this thinking or mind. And I've been reading a lot recently on intelligence analysis, and particularly on cognitive bias, and people do. And I'd like to do a little bit more work on that. I might even want to write a book on it, on how our biases can influence getting it wrong and missing things. But I don't.
You suggest some books on that, probably on radicalization, on psychology. or probably it's fine. If what I can do is probably when you get time, probably if you could.
I'll send you an email.
Exactly. That
Yeah.
works for me as well. Yeah. I'll
I
probably
mean,
put the link.
yeah, like I've read a lot on, I mean, Al Qaeda and Afghanistan and Jordan and when we even had an Al Qaeda threat in Canada with the train system. So I have read things. It's just not off the top of my head.
That's
And
perfectly
it's a
fine.
type of thing at the end of the day, at the end of work when you go home.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to read about a terrorist. It's just maybe if I wasn't working in it, I would want to read it.
Yeah.
It could be. It's like when you're in school, you can't wait till school's over so you can read something you really want to read.
That's perfectly fine. I mean, thank you so much for taking your time and being on the show.
Pleasure.
It's an honor to host you, and probably we didn't bore you a lot with the question.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Rodney, and I'm impressed with your knowledge, and you know about Canada. Like, we're not used to that. We're boring.
It's more interesting because, as you mentioned, that the more it's the relation between like terrorists. It's easier. Like, for example, we look abroad. Like, so for example, in the Middle East or the African continent, it's there. But in the recent 150 years of history of Canada since independence, it's a little tricky to get those information, and I think that's more challenging and nice because coming from a country like India, where probably you open newspaper every day, you find one or the attack every day.
Yes. I think it's more of an existential, constant threat for India, and it would be disingenuous of me to say, "Oh, it's the same in Canada. We understand and all that." It's I can't imagine how your country manages the terrorist threats. And on that, but that's what we have in common, right? It's easy any country to talk about terrorism because nobody likes them really. Well, there's a few countries that like them, but it's a common theme, and it's easy to talk about. It's easy to share because it's wrong.
Well, terrorism is a state policy for some countries, not meant,
Yes.
not putting it out there, but yeah, we have good neighbors.
Yes, you're not very far from where you are. I know. That's why I say I'm amazed sometimes at your tolerance and patience of what you put up with. And I guess it speaks to your democracy, speaks to your country.
Yeah. So thank you once again, and lovely talking to you. And probably we're gonna definitely interview sometime when you write that book that you spoke about.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll be in Corella or something like that, and you can interview me.
I'll definitely take you around.
Okay. And I'll send you some books. I'll email you some
Sure.
books.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, and I'll be in touch with you.
Will do, Ratni. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.